in July of 1995, a team of forensic scientists did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. They dug up the grave of Jesse James, America's most famous outlaw. And what they found inside that coffin would reignite a century-old controversy that refuses to die. For more than 100 years, people had been whispering the same question. Was Jesse James really killed by Bob Ford on April 3, 1882? Or did the outlaw pull off his greatest escape, faking his death and slipping away to live out his days in peace? When Bob Ford shot a man in the back of the head that spring day in St. Joseph, Missouri, Jesse's mother identified the body. A photograph was taken of the corpse on ice. The funeral was held, but the doubts never went away. Science finally had the tools to settle this mystery once and for all. DNA testing, which had only recently been used to identify historical remains, could give us a definitive answer. Professor James Starrs, a forensic scientist and lawyer from George Washington University, assembled a team of experts. They got permission from Jesse's descendants and a court order to open the grave at Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, Missouri. The Discovery Channel sent cameras. News crews from around the world showed up. Between 300 and 500 people gathered at the cemetery to watch. The DNA results came back with what seemed like certainty, but instead of ending the debate, those results started a whole new fight that's still going on today. To understand why anyone doubted the official story in the first place, you have to go back to 1948. That's when a 100-year-old man named J. Frank Dalton stepped forward in Lyon, Oklahoma, and made an extraordinary claim. He said he was Jesse James, alive and well 66 years after his supposed death. Dalton didn't just make this claim quietly. On April 24, 1948, he signed an affidavit in front of a notary public stating that his real name was Jesse Woodson James, born September 5, 1847, in what became Cary, Missouri. The document was published on the front page of the Leon-Constitution newspaper the following month. On May 22, Dalton made 2 public appearances in Eltaney's business district, telling stories about life in the Old West to crowds who came to see if this could possibly be true. The story sounds ridiculous on its face, but Dalton had details that gave people pause. He claimed that the man shot by Bob Ford was actually Charlie Bigelow, a member of the James gang who looked enough like Jesse to pass for him. According to Dalton's version of events, after Bigelow was killed, Jesse fled to Kansas City, then Memphis, New Orleans, and Florida. He went to Brazil, spent time in Mexico, and eventually returned to Oklahoma, where he was supposedly elected to the territorial legislature under the name J. Frank Dalton. What made some people take him seriously? Dalton had scars that seemed to match what Jesse James should have had. 7 bullet wounds, a rope burn around his neck, a collapsed lung, a damaged fingertip, severely burned feet. These weren't just stories. People examined him and saw the scars. Even respected journalist and novelist Robert Ruhr became convinced that Dalton might be telling the truth. The owner of Merrimack Caverns in Missouri, Lester Dill, and his general manager Rudy Turilli got involved. They'd been promoting the caverns as a Jesse James hideout for years, and they saw an opportunity. They brought Dalton to the caverns and even hosted a birthday party for him on September 5, 1949, celebrating what would have been his 110th birthday as Jesse James. Dalton died in Granbury, Texas on August 15, 1951. That's what went on his gravestone too. So when the exhumation team arrived at Mount Olivet Cemetery on July 17, 1995, the stakes couldn't have been higher. If the body in that grave wasn't Jesse James, then maybe Dalton had been telling the truth. Maybe the greatest outlaw in American history had pulled off the ultimate con. The dig started on a Monday, and right away things got complicated. Based on newspaper accounts from 1882, the team expected to find a metal casket. Instead, they found wood partially collapsed for more than a century underground. At first, there was confusion about whether they'd even opened the right grave. The team wondered if the headstones had been reversed and they'd accidentally dug up Jesse's wife, Zeralda. They kept digging, using tells and brushes. Now, treating it like an archaeological site, what they found wasn't promising. There were bone fragments, bits of fabric, but nothing that looked like the well-preserved remains they'd hoped for. Professor Starrs addressed the crowd and the press, trying to manage expectations. The investigation would continue the next day. They needed more time. When they finally got a good look at what was in that grave, they faced a massive problem. The soil in Mount Olivet Cemetery was wet and acidic. Exactly the wrong conditions for preserving human remains. The bones had deteriorated badly. What should have been solid bone had turned soft, almost mushy in some places. The team tried to extract DNA from a femur, one of the largest bones in the human body and usually one of the best sources for genetic material. Nothing. The DNA was too degraded. The same thing happened with another bone sample. After all this effort, after all the publicity and planning, it looked like the scientist might have to admit defeat. They dug up Jesse James for nothing, but they kept looking through the debris from the coffin, sifting carefully through the soil and fragments. That's when they found something that gave them hope. 2 teeth, and they were in better condition than the bones. The team also had something else to work with. Back in 1978, there had been another exhumation at the James farm, Jesse's original burial site. Some hair had been recovered during that dig and stored at the James Farm Museum. Professor Starrs went back to court on September 15, 1995. He got Judge Vic Howard to issue an order requiring the museum to hand over that hair for DNA testing. Now they had material to work with, but they had to use a different approach than they'd originally planned. The standard method for DNA identification uses what's called nuclear DNA, the genetic information we inherit from both parents. But nuclear DNA degrades quickly, especially in conditions like the wet, acidic soil at Mount Olivet Cemetery. The team turned to mitochondrial DNA instead. This is genetic material that's passed down only through the maternal line from mother to children. It's much more stable than nuclear DNA and can survive in conditions where other genetic material breaks down. The samples were sent to Pennsylvania State University for analysis, but having DNA from the grave wasn't enough. They needed something to compare it to. The team tracked down 2 descendants of Susan James Palmer, Jesse's sister. If the remains in the grave were actually Jesse's, his mitochondrial DNA should match theirs because they all inherited it from the same maternal line going back to Jesse's mother, Seralda. The researchers extracted DNA from 2 of the 4 teeth they recovered. 2 of the hair samples from the 1978 dig also yielded usable DNA. When they analyzed the sequences, all 4 samples were identical. That meant they all came from the same person, which was a good sign. It suggested the evidence hadn't been mixed up or contaminated. Then came the comparison with the descendants. The mitochondrial DNA sequence from the teeth and hair matched the sequence from Jesse's sister's descendants. The match wasn't just close, it was exact. But how rare was this particular DNA sequence? If it was common, the match wouldn't mean much. An unrelated person could have the same sequence just by chance. The researchers searched the forensic mitochondrial DNA database, which at the time contained 26 different sequences. The sequence from the grave didn't appear in the database at all, not even once. The statistics told the story. Based on the DNA evidence, there was approximately a 99.7% probability that the remains were those of Jesse James. On February 23, 1996, Professor Starrs made his announcement at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences meeting in Nashville, Tennessee. He told reporters that he had Jesse by science. The body in the grave was Jesse James. The case was closed. Except it wasn't. The DNA results should have ended the controversy, but instead they created new questions. It took 5 years for the full scientific report to be published. When Dr. Ann Stone, Dr. Mark Stone King, and Professor Starrs finally issued their complete findings, the language was more careful than the initial announcement. They said the DNA testing supported the identification of the remains as Jesse James, but they also acknowledged that absolute proof was impossible. They were putting the burden back on the doubters to prove them wrong. Some of those doubters looked closely at the details of the investigation and didn't like what they saw. The teeth that yielded the DNA, they pointed out, were found loose in the soil, not attached to a jawbone. How did they get there? Could someone have planted them? Stephen Caruso, who was the deputy counselor for Clay County in 1995, later made a shocking claim to researchers Betty Dorset Duke and Greg Ellison. Caruso said that when Judge Howard ordered the James Farm Museum to turn over hair for DNA testing, the museum didn't comply. Instead, according to Caruso, he obtained hair from John Hartman, the director of the Clay County Parks Department, which owned and operated the museum. If Caruso's account is true, the DNA testing wasn't done on hair from Jesse James at all. It was done on hair from a man who died more than a century later. Critics also pointed out problems with the chain of custody for the evidence. In forensic investigations, every piece of evidence needs to be carefully tracked from the moment it's collected to the moment it's tested. That way, the evidence hasn't been tampered with or mixed up, but the 1995 exhumation apparently didn't follow proper chain of custody procedures. The teeth and hair weren't continuously monitored and documented in the way they should have been, and there was the matter of J. Frank Dalton's grave. In May of 2000, forensic scientists exhumed a body buried in Granbury Cemetery under the name Jesse Woodson James. If Dalton really was Jesse James, his DNA should match the samples from Jesse's relatives too. But there was a problem. When they opened the grave, they found 2 coffins. The exhumation order only allowed them to test one body, so they chose the casket closest to the headstone. The results came back, and the DNA didn't match Jesse James, but it also didn't match the known relatives of J. Frank Dalton. The body they tested belonged to a man named William Henry Holland, who died in 1927. So whose body was in that grave, and where was J. Frank Dalton actually buried? To this day, nobody knows for sure. The controversy hasn't died down. A book written by distant relatives of Jesse James heavily disputes the 1995 DNA results. Amateur historians and Jesse James researchers continue to debate the evidence online and at conferences. Some of them are convinced the 1995 exhumation was compromised from the start, that the people running the James Farm Museum had a financial interest in proving the body was Jesse's because it brought tourists to the site. There's a dark irony in all of this. Jesse's mother, Zeralda Samuel, used to sell rocks from her son's original grave for 25 cents each, making money off his notoriety. More than a century later, the debate about whether he's really buried there still drives tourism and generates income for the town of Kearney. Looking at the evidence today, what can we actually say? The scientific case for the 1995 identification seems solid on paper. The mitochondrial DNA sequence was rare. It matched Jesse's maternal relatives. The odds of finding that specific sequence in an unrelated person were extremely low, but the questions about the chain of custody are legitimate. If Stephen Caruso's claims are true, and the hair that was tested didn't actually come from the 1978 exhumation, that's a serious problem. The fact that the teeth were found loose in the soil rather than in a jawbone does raise questions, even if there could be innocent explanations like the natural breakdown of the body over time. The truth is, we may never know with absolute certainty. DNA science has advanced considerably. Since 1995, modern techniques could potentially extract better samples and provide more definitive answers. But the controversy has become so politicized with different camps dug into their positions that another exhumation seems unlikely. What we're left with is a very American story. Jesse James became a legend because people wanted to believe in a certain kind of outlaw, someone who robbed from the rich and stood up to authority. The idea that he faked his death and lived to old age fits that legend perfectly. It's the ultimate escape, the final trick pulled on the establishment that was always trying to catch him. J. Frank Dalton, whether he was a con artist or a confused old man, tapped into that desire. He told people what they wanted to hear, that Jesse James had beaten the system one last time, and when the DNA evidence said otherwise, some people simply refused to accept it. The grave at Mount Olivet Cemetery still draws visitors. The marker reads, Jesse W. James, September 5, 1847, assassinated April 3, 1882. In Granbury, Texas, another grave marker tells a different story, claiming Jesse survived until 1951. Both graves have their believers. In 1882, after the shooting in St. Joseph, thousands of people filed past the coffin to view the body. Many of them knew Jesse personally. They said it was him, but within hours, the doubts began. How could Jesse James, who'd evaded capture so many times, let himself be shot by Bob Ford? It didn't fit the legend. The 1995 DNA results, with their 99.7% certainty, should have put those doubts to rest. But legends are hard to kill, harder even than the men who inspire them. Science can give us probabilities and statistics. It can tell us what's most likely to be true. But it can't always overcome what people want to believe. Do you trust the DNA evidence from 1995? Or do you think there's still a chance that Jesse James pulled off one final escape? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed diving into this historical mystery, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are plenty more stories from the Wild West where the truth is stranger than the legend, and the legend refuses to die.